Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. Welcome to The Tom Woods Show, episode 2536, with, for the very first time, Mark Moss of The Mark Moss Show, aptly named. He is also the author of the Uncommunist Manifesto. I had a chance to meet Mark in Las Vegas at Freedom Fest in July of this year, and he interviewed me in what I think is one of the best interviews I've ever done. So I began to think maybe this is a candidate for the old Tom Woods Show. And so that is indeed what we are doing here. I'm very glad to welcome Mark Moss to the Tom Woods Show for the very first time.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Such a pleasure to be here. I've been a big fan of yours for a long time. Obviously a fan of freedom, which is why we were at the Freedom Fest together. And I enjoyed sitting down with you. So yeah, thanks for having me on.
Well, pleasure's mine. All right, I have some things, of course, I want to talk to you about that would include the Uncommunist Manifesto. But before we get to that, I have some Bitcoin-related questions for you. And I know you as well as somebody could know somebody after one interview and following each other on Twitter for a little while. But I actually don't know where you stand when it comes to your opinions on Bitcoin. I mean, obviously, you're in favor, but I have a lot of friends who are opinion molders when it comes to Bitcoin, and they sometimes disagree among themselves regarding, for example, what their opinions are about non-Bitcoin cryptocurrencies or the Bitcoin Cash controversy or all that. There are a lot of different shades of opinion out there, and I don't exactly know which one yours is, but I guess I'm going to uncover that over the course of this conversation. What I want to ask you about first is, what do you think about the fact that we now live in a world where like a Donald Trump, and I think an RFK Jr., but that I'm not as sure of, would suddenly now have a policy position with regard to Bitcoin that's favorable and actually think that people who are interested in Bitcoin and cryptocurrency constitute a constituency now that they would want to appeal to?
Well, Tom, I think the stranger thing is that we would live in a world where a leader would take a stance, especially a leader of a free world, a potential leader of the free world would take a stance where they would take away your freedom to choose how you want to save your money. I think that's a more strange world. I think that we would have two potential, presidential candidates, RFK now conceding, but RFK and Trump saying, hey, you're free to choose how you want to save your money and spend. I don't find that weird in the land of the free. I do think it. I think it does. Obviously show that Bitcoin and cryptocurrency overall has gained, I would say, mainstream adoption at this point. I think there's still a lot of people who think it's some strange internet money, magic internet money. It's a scam. It's a pet rock, whatever. I don't think anybody can say that anymore. When you have Larry Fink, the head of BlackRock, the largest asset manager in the world, going on the news saying it's a legitimate asset. You have presidential candidates running on a platform. A pro-Bitcoin, pro-crypto platform. So I think it's certainly what we'd call in technology, in the diffusion of innovation, it's crossed the chasm, in my opinion, to become mainstream. Some estimates are that there's about 50 million Americans that own Bitcoin at this point. We know that, there was over a dozen congressmen and so forth at the Bitcoin conference just about a month ago. So it's reached the highest level of governments. We know Patrick McHenry, who, from the Financial Services Committee, has been running the Bitcoin white paper in his office for years at this point. And so it certainly puts a stamp on it that it's here in the mainstream.
Are there particular proposals that you've heard that when you heard them, you said, yes, I would like to see this implemented? I mean, the one that I want to hear, and maybe RFK said it, but again, it's my fault for not checking up on that. The one I want to hear is that we're no longer going to classify Bitcoin in such a way that you're subject to capital gains taxation when you sell it. That I'd like to see. But we've been hearing things like a strategic Bitcoin reserve and stuff like that. What do you think about any of this stuff?
Yeah, I think, a lot of Bitcoiners are resistant to that. We're here to, as we say, separate money from state. And so I would also put myself in that camp. And so they say, oh, now you're trying to, bend the knee to the politicians. I don't see it that way. I see it's about time that freedom-minded people have now moved into the government. So I don't see it that way as bending a knee. I think it's a natural evolution. So to your point, yes, RFK, very well laid out a platform at the Bitcoin conference of how he would use Bitcoin in the government from a strategic Bitcoin reserve, to your point, taking about a little over 200,000 Bitcoin that are on the U.S. government's books today and moving those into a reserve asset, as well as continuing to buy Bitcoin as well. The Trump campaign has been sort of along the same lines as that as well. And I think that's a good idea. I mean, sure. I think we're not going to grow our way out of this $35 trillion in debt, Tom. You're well aware of that. And so we're going to need some sort of a miracle or combination, most likely, of miracles. We need to unleash the American economy. We need to let the entrepreneurs build and grow. But we also probably need some sort of an asset. And so putting Bitcoin on the balance sheet, sort of like a reserve. And basically what they proposed is to build up enough Bitcoin on the reserve balance sheet to match the amount of gold reserves that we have. And so I think it's a great idea. I think it would certainly set the floor price from gold. And as I said earlier, it certainly shows that we have jumped the chasm. It certainly puts Bitcoin to the mainstream at that point. And I would add back to the point that you asked about the tax situation. Unfortunately, one thing that certainly holds Bitcoin back is that tax situation. It's treated as property. It's treated as an asset. And so therefore, it's, under the regulations of capital gains taxes, which can be a very big problem when you want to try to use it as a currency. So, for example, if I went to Starbucks to buy a cup of coffee, I spend my $3, $4 or $5, $6 on a coffee at Starbucks today. And I have to go, well, when did I buy this Bitcoin? And what was my cost basis? And what is my profit at this point, profit or loss? And then I have to file that into my taxes. And then it's just never really going to work for a medium of exchange in a proper reported tax system or regime, if you'll call it that, until something like that is resolved. There's been some talks about lowering a requirement. Let's say that like transactions under $600 would be exempt from something like that. I would imagine we'd see something like that first. However, that's from the Kennedy-Trump campaign. From the other side, from the Kamala campaign, we've already seen her tax plans. There's certainly no lowering of taxes coming from that side.
Yeah, and so I've been thinking to myself, the likelihood that any relief could come with regard to the tax side of things will increase along with the number of congressmen who own Bitcoin. That's what I think. That when they come to own it, all of a sudden,
and like I said, we've already started to. Yeah, and we've already started to reach that level of penetration inside the government, as I said, and not just the senators, congressmen, et cetera, but even the highest levels of finance industry, for example, right? And now all of a sudden they could be potential allies in the war of regulations and lobbying and so forth. So we might see it sooner than later.
All right, I'm going to ask you a question that it's just an awful question to ask when talking about Bitcoin. It's an awful question because no matter how you answer it, you're going to anger somebody, but that's just
okay
true.
With that.
I mean, Bitcoin is like the early years of Christianity when people would try to discuss the Trinity. Almost anything they said, somebody pounced on them for. So likewise, I think with this. So I know plenty of people who say Bitcoin or bust, so-called Bitcoin maximalists, Bitcoin or bust, and that the other cryptocurrencies are quote unquote, well, let's just say, by the way, I'm very proud. I've had a number of people say recently that I'm one of the few remaining podcasts they can listen to with kids in the car. So I'll just say the claim is that other coins are blank coins and it rhymes with Bitcoins, but I think you know what I'm saying. Yeah. What's your opinion on that? Because I have friends who kind of feel that way, but who will then say, but I make an exception for Monero, or I make an exception for this, that, or the other thing. What's your opinion?
Well, my opinion, Tom, let me just preface this by saying that I started buying Bitcoin in 2015. And when at first it was a way to try to get money out of the banking system. I was afraid of another bank collapse after 2008, being shell-shocked. And as I started putting money into Bitcoin and I started paying attention, I was like, wow, this is a tool that we can actually win. Like, this is a tool that we can change the world with. And so I went deep down and I had to start talking about Bitcoin. I've never stopped. I say that to then say that then I did go down to the crypto rabbit hole. And then I was like, well, it's not Bitcoin, it's blockchain. Blockchain's the real revolution. And so I started writing a cryptocurrency research newsletter. From 2016 to 2019, every month I'd publish personally 20 to 25 pages of research on different crypto projects, Monero, XRP, you name it. Over those 4 years, I published over 1,000 pages of research on all the crypto projects that are out there. I tell you that just to lend a little bit of credibility to what I'm about to say next. After 4 years of writing that research newsletter and publishing over 1,000 pages of research, and my experience having invested through the dot-com bubble, and I'm a tech investor, I run a hedge fund today. My experience of understanding how technology works, how technology cycles work, and my deep research into cryptocurrency, in 2019, I concluded that all of the cryptocurrency is basically an arbitrage on the trend. And it's not worth paying attention to anymore. And I have been Bitcoin only ever since. And so to the people that would say it's, not Bitcoin, it's Monero, it's XRP, et cetera, I would just say that they don't understand enough about the different disciplines to understand the difference. So Bitcoin is unlike other cryptocurrencies in many ways. Now, Monero, we'll put that one on the side, but there's 2.4 million cryptocurrencies. And we like to say Bitcoin, not crypto. And the reason why, it gets into a little bit of a technical definition, but the world has problems. And as entrepreneurs, we're supposed to create solutions to these problems. And I think you and I certainly would agree, most people would agree, that there's some big problems we have in the world today. For example, endless money printing. That's a big problem. We also have a problem with censorship of our money, right? Being able to hold it without it being seized. We also have a problem with not being able to transact freely. Those are problems that we need solutions for. And so Bitcoin created a solution to those problems. And the biggest way that it solved those problems is becoming decentralized. And so that means that instead of a central server that Facebook or Google could choke off, now instead of having one database, anyone can run a database. There's millions of databases, and anybody that wants to can run a database. And this is the key piece here, Tom. You see, the Bitcoin database has been kept very, very small. It's about, 400 or 500 gigabytes today. And that means that anybody anywhere in the world, even in Africa with a 5-year-old laptop, could run the entire Bitcoin database and could run a node. And that is what keeps it decentralized. But the problem with all of the other cryptocurrencies is that you cannot do that. Most of them run on a different consensus mechanism altogether, known as proof of stake. And so let's just use Ethereum, like the second largest one. You and I cannot run that. We would have to run a pruned or a shortened version of the database. And even then, we would still need a professional server, a very expensive server, and it would have to be co-located into a professional facility. Now, we saw how well that worked with Parler when Trump moved over there after he got kicked off of Twitter. And so what's happened is all of these cryptocurrencies become centralized because they can't run, or people, you and I, people in Africa cannot run databases. And that is the single biggest distinction that I can kind of break between these. And I'll just finish by saying, again, back to the problems that we had, what the world needs to solve those problems, what the world needs is a decentralized system that no government or anybody can control. The world did not need faster money.
Hey folks, quick message from Virtual Storefronts. If you own a local business and you know you should probably be online, but you have no idea where to start and you're sure you can't afford it, then Virtual Storefronts is for you. They help local businesses get online faster and quicker than ever before, and they focus on getting local results in the search engines. You just set it and forget it. You set up keywords that match items you sell, and the Virtual Storefronts backend handles the rest. No maintenance or upkeep required. So you name it. Restaurants, boutiques, salons, farmers markets, food trucks, art galleries, gift shops, event services, lawyers, insurance agents, cleaning, landscaping, whatever you can dream up. Any locally owned, non-major franchise that is 12 or fewer locations business that maintains regular hours and serves the public in a local area is qualified to create, maintain, and communicate with the public with a storefront at virtualstorefronts.com. Absolutely fantastic. Check it out. Get all the details at virtualstorefronts.co. That's virtualstorefronts.co. Now, I don't say this to disparage people who happen to be partisans of other kinds of crypto, but I will say that I think a lot of amateurs, a lot of people who are kind of on the sidelines of all this, and they view it as a possibility, as a chance to maybe reproduce that moment when they might have been able to get in on Bitcoin at 10 cents. So maybe one of these other ones, if they gamble just right, holds out for them the opportunity to get a do-over. They missed out on Bitcoin when they could have gotten in when it was at rock bottom at the very beginning. Well, here are some other ones that are at their very beginnings. What's the harm in throwing $1,000 into this one, $1,000 into this one? They view it in that way, but so are they? They're just all wrong. And I know, by the way, this is offensive to people who they look at Bitcoin and they think this is a world-changing technology, and it offends me that some people are thinking of it as just like their path to a prosperous retirement. It's so much more than that.
Well, Tom, I think it's not wrong. It's actually right. And so I think the difference is that back to what about XYZ token, 2.4 million tokens? What do you mean it's a scam or it's not the same? Look how much money I made. But remember what I said. Bitcoin is a tool that we can change the world with. Bitcoin is a way that we can separate money and state. I'm not here to make a little bit more US dollars. So for those people who want to gamble, there's no shortage of ways to gamble. And if they want to YOLO into some meme coin, a dog coin or whatever, and make some more US dollars, that's fine. But don't confuse that with a new technology that's revolutionary and that can literally change the world and bring freedom back for you and I. So I think most people that are deep down into the Bitcoin space are in it for freedom. They're in it to change the world for the better, not to make a few more dollars. And I think that's the big distinction. And I think, and again, like I said, people say, but what do you mean? Look how much money I made. We're not the same. We're not focusing on the same things. Now, what I would say to that though, Tom, is back to, I'm, as a tech investor running a tech fund, doing this for a long time. What happens is that technology always rolls out the same predictable path. So you have these technological revolutions that happen on about a 50-year time frame. And on this 50-year time frame, there's 4 distinct phases that happens. And what happens is in the beginning, we have a brand new technological breakthrough. It's a cluster of technologies. Let's use the automobile. 1908, Henry Ford created the automobile. But it wasn't just the automobile. It was oil futures, fuels, and also the assembly line. And what happened is that new technology burst out, and then the speculators rushed in. And within a few years, there was 250 automobile manufacturers. But there was a problem. It's always the same. There was a problem. It was a scaling problem. There were no roads to drive the cars on, and there were no gas stations, and there were no tire places. And those 250 automobile manufacturers went bankrupt. We had 3 that remained. And then it continued on the path. We saw the same thing happen in the internet days. 1999, the famous, .com bubble, which then blew up. And the same problem. We had all these websites, webvan.com, pets.com. They weren't wrong, but they were too early. There was a scaling problem. The internet was too slow. You couldn't really use it at that time, right? And we saw the same thing with cryptocurrency. And so what happened is when Bitcoin came out, Bitcoin was too slow. It could never scale. It'll never handle enough transactions and all of these things. And so we had all these altcoins. We can use the altcoin word on your show. We had all these altcoins that popped up to be this, like I said, arbitrage on the trend. They were faster. They were cheaper. They were more private or whatever it was because Bitcoin had a scaling problem. But the scaling problem's been fixed. And now that the scaling problem's been fixed, all the wealth is moving back into Bitcoin. And the reason why I say this is to all the people listening that are like, but I made so much money on XYZ token, or I'm trying to find the next Bitcoin. That was a period in 2017, 18, 19, even in 2020, the altcoin explosion blew up and people did make a lot of money in that period. But after the fall of FTX, when Sam Bankman-Fried famously, stole everybody's money, billions of dollars, gave it all to the Democratic Party. That's another topic. But since that time, the amount of regulation that's came into the space has basically prevented U.S. venture capitalists from dumping hundreds of billions of dollars into the space. And since that time, since the fall of FTX, out of 2.4 million tokens, altcoins, only 8 have made a new all-time high priced in Bitcoin. Only 8. And so what that shows us is the altcoin boom, the explosion, is gone. Now, certainly there's still people making money. Don't get me wrong. But 8 out of 2.4 million, I'm not that lucky. And so what's happening is the next shift, now that all this is being built on top of Bitcoin, the real money, institutional money, is coming in and they're investing into Bitcoin and Bitcoin derivatives. So these are companies that are building on and around the Bitcoin ecosystem. That's where things are going now.
You were saying that, many Bitcoin advocates, that Bitcoin has the potential to change the world. The thing is, when I first learned about it, when a couple of people sat me down and explained it to me, the messaging was very much, there's nothing governments can do about this. It's an amazing phenomenon, and it's gonna sweep the world, and there's nothing governments can do. I've noticed that messaging has certainly been muted in recent years, because apparently there is something governments can do. There's plenty governments can do. So what needs to happen here? I mean, do governments just have to sheepishly repeal the various disabilities they've placed on Bitcoin? Is that what we're waiting for? Or is there some way Bitcoin can overcome things like this tax problem?
Yeah, Tom, there is nothing the governments can do, but there is something they can do. So the governments can kill you on sight, right? Hey, if we catch you with Bitcoin, we'll just kill you. They could certainly do that, Tom. But how well has that worked for the war on drugs, right? Drugs are physical. They have to be grown, cultivated, packaged, processed, shipped, smuggled, distributed, and they can't even stop drugs. They can't even stop drugs from going into a prison. How do they stop something digital? And the problem is also the incentive system, and this is why a lot of people don't understand Bitcoin, because it takes a lot of different disciplines. So if you think about human incentives, when the government tells you not to do drugs, it certainly doesn't make you want to do that. But if they tell you that you don't have a right to store your wealth in a way they can't steal from you, it sort of makes you want to do that. Like every time they talk about gun confiscation, gun sales go through the roof. But really, Tom, what I would do is point to history, and I know you're a big history buff. And what we can see through thousands of years of history is it's always technology that changes the world. It's not politics, it's always technology. And I think really one of the best periods to go back to is I would point you back to the 1500s. And in the 1500s, we had the Protestant Reformation. And what happened is about 70 years earlier, a piece of technology was invented. It was the printing press. And the printing press started to mass produce information. And after Martin Luther put the 95 Theses on the church door, people started to read the Bible for themselves and said, wait a minute, church, what you've been telling us is wrong this whole time. And we don't need this central path to God. We can go decentralized on our own. And of course, the church, just like I said, the government could do with Bitcoin, the church did kill people. They labeled them heretics, and it was punishable by death. And I don't know how many people died during that period, but it was a lot. But it couldn't stop the change that was happening. And so back to the question you're asking, the government isn't really able to do anything about it, as far as they can't confiscate it from you. They can't prevent me from saving in it because they can't steal it from me. They can't inflate it away because they can't print more of it. And they can't stop me from sending that to you because it's censorship resistant. They could say it's illegal. They could certainly do that, Tom, and they could certainly threaten us with death. But just like the printing press and the Protestant Reformation, I think it would only lead to more proliferation of it and not less.
All right, let's talk about something a little bit different, but that also has a Bitcoin angle in it. So you have it's a short treatise. It's under 100 pages that I recently read, the Uncommunist Manifesto. Very well timed, because there's a lot of interest in communism these days. So, first of all, where does this idea come from? I mean, there have been criticisms of the Communist Manifesto before, and when I set out to engage in a large-scale writing project, there's never been a case where there wasn't some, turning point, some kind of tripwire or something that just made me say, doggone it, I have got to sit down and write this thing. As Richard Nixon said, I never quote Richard Nixon, but he said that writing a book is the biggest workout somebody can give his brain. And I do agree with him on that. So I'm not going to do that lightly unless I feel absolutely compelled to do it. So what was that thing in your case?
Yeah, what that was, it was 2020, right? It was the pandemic that woke a lot of people up and red-pilled people, or whatever you want to call it. And what it was specifically was being a huge fan of freedom, I consider myself a freedom maximalist, and I consider myself a free market person and a capitalist, if we can use that word. I had started moving away from that word capitalist and just kind of used free markets because capitalist had this bad connotation to it. So I've always considered myself that way, and I've studied a lot of history and how communism, socialism works, and I've studied Marxism and all those things. But in 2020, I remember it was the ladies that were running BLM, and they said they were trained Marxists. And I thought, I talk about all the time. I was doing a lot of research into the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab, and I read his books, The Great Reset and things like that. And I told people, on my shows, I don't even want to quote what I get from those books because I'll sound like a crazy person. I recommend that you go read it directly from the source. So I always tell people, go read from the source, listen to what they say. And so here I hear these ladies from BLM saying they were trained Marxists. And I just thought, I've read all this about communism and even Marxism, but I've never actually read the Communist Manifesto. So I did. So I bought the book off Amazon. I read it. And I was shocked, Tom. I was like, have people ever read this book? I can't imagine people who read this book and they're okay with this. Like, he starts out by saying, to summarize communism in one statement is the abolition of private property. Like, what? Like, I can't imagine people would be okay with this. So that was sort of where the idea started. And I was on a trip down to El Salvador being the first nation in the world to adopt Bitcoin as a legal tender. And I was working with the Bitcoin community down there. And I was with my co-author, Alex Fetsky. We were there together. And I said, have you ever read it? And he's much more read than I am. And he had neither. So we read the book, and I said, I think somebody needs to make a rebuttal to this. We need to answer this. We need to rewrite it. And so that's really where the spark came from.
Well, I was pleasantly surprised to note, first of all, I know a few people in your acknowledgements, which is nice. But I'm also familiar with people I haven't met. I mean, Ludwig von Mises I never met, and Friedrich Hayek I never met. But I did meet Murray Rothbard, and I do know Hans Hoppe. So to see him in there was also somewhat gratifying and nice to see. But yeah, I assigned it years and years ago and had it assigned to me just because for all the wickedness that's in it, it's a good springboard for conversation. You could certainly say that.
Yeah.
And it's a short book. I think some people expect the Communist Manifesto to be this gigantic tome, and it's not. And your response to it is shorter still. And I think because it's not a gigantic tome is why it had the perhaps the influence that it did. I mean, very, very few, even Marxists, have actually tried to read Capital. Very few. I mean, you encounter them, instantly that they haven't done that. And likewise, Hayek himself, by far his most popular work is The Road to Serfdom, which is a short-ish book, and not his complicated economic treatises. Or Machiavelli, The Prince, at least reasonably short. For some reason, I think I know why, these things tend to get public attention a lot better. And so you've done one better. You've got an even shorter kind of response. Now, what did you feel like the absolute heart of that response had to be? Like, what you can make a whole bunch of little arguments, but what is the pivot point around which these spokes are revolving?
Yeah, I think the pivot point was when we decided that, I wanted to bring attention. I thought if we brought attention to the Communist Manifesto, I might encourage people to actually read it. And I thought that if we could actually get people to read it, it might make them realize how bad it is. So it wasn't, and so it was like, how do we do this? How do we want to approach it? We want to really do it tit for tat, like try to break it apart. And, what we decided to do, which both my co-author and myself think is a much more powerful way to do things, is instead of trying to focus on the bad and tear things down, let's come out with a new hope. So instead of trying to say, oh, this is bad, here's why they're wrong, we didn't do any of that. Basically, what we did is we just put this 180-degree difference, and we tried to create a new hope. We thought that if we could reclaim the word capitalism, we could get people to rise up. We wanted to challenge people to rise up, to be better versions of themselves, and to change the world positively. We believe in being positive influence, not trying to tell people what to do, but trying to lead by that. And so really that was the key piece of the book, was to give people hope, to give people a challenge, and to give people a better path to move forward. And I think, I think the original book was about 8,000 words. We came out to about 10,000 words. We're just quite a bit bigger, longer, but we started the book with definitions. And that was another big thing that we decided to do. And the reason why, what I've found after speaking at lots of conferences and lots of online debates, a lot of times people actually agree, but maybe we are using the wrong definition of a word. And so we're talking past people. And so rather than put them at the end of the book, we started with the beginning of the book. Here's the definitions. Here's what we mean by these words. And so we could try to take people through this book all on the same page. And so that was the goal. It was a goal of hope and a book of challenge.
Hey, everybody, let's take a minute to thank our sponsor, Persist SEO. If you are getting buried by your competition online, then build your brand, your reputation, and your lead flow with digital marketing by Persist SEO. If you are a small local business trying to compete against large companies in the service industry, then increase your visibility with Persist SEO. Or what if you have low or no leads coming in on a consistent basis? Well, then website search engine and conversion optimization can help move the needle to a more prosperous business model for you. Are you tired of cold calling and networking, meeting places getting shut down? Use your website as a lead generation engine. Or what if you're not showing up for your services in the search engines? Well, get found with Persist SEO's expert search engine optimization. All you have to do is call 770-580-3736 or visit them at ineedseo.help for a free website audit and consultation. That's 770-580-3736 or ineedseo.help. Obviously, the idea of classes is central to what Marx talks about, and there's been a lot written on that general subject about what Marx meant by a class and this, that, or the other thing. But without getting into the weeds of any of that, just sticking to the basic gist of it, you seem to think there's something wrong with the way he looks at classes, and that one of them is that his conception seems to be extremely static. Like we have the working class here or the poor here, and then we have the bourgeoisie here, and that's just it. That's the way life is. This person was just destined to be this way, and this one's going to be this way. But that's not actually how, we have empirical studies of this, where these are rare because they're very, very laborious to carry out, but where we actually follow people through their lives or through a 10-year period, let's say, and we say, well, isn't this interesting? These people who were in the lowest earning quintile, 8 years later, 40% of them were in a higher quintile. Right. Well, that's, I'm not sure that Marx even makes allowance for that.
Well, I have to constantly ask myself, is this evil or is this incompetence, right? I'm sure you ask yourself that a lot. And sometimes it's both, right? Maybe there's some of both. I had originally assigned a lot of maybe more incompetence to Marx when I started digging into him. He was certainly a subject of his environment, right? So he came from a well-to-do family. He lived a very poor life. It was a hard life. And ironically, all the things that he seemed to have a gripe with capitalism would have solved his problem. And so what do I mean by that? So yes, he makes the case of the two classes, the rich and the poor. And to your point, yes, they're very static. So the rich are oppressors. Okay, great. So at what point do I become the rich? And to the point that you said, if I made it from the lower class to the upper class, if I came forward a rich, am I all of a sudden I'm an oppressor now too? And so it became very static, and obviously that didn't make any sense. But he says specifically in the Communist Manifesto that the poor have no capital. All they have is their labor. And just the irony of that, because what capitalism actually did was it actually gave the poor people capital from their ideas. So today we have mental capital. Obviously, writing a book is now capital. You or I are able to make money by providing information. And so Marx wanted to write philosophy, and he was mad at the world because he couldn't afford to provide for his family writing philosophy. But today, he could have a career doing philosophy because the capitalist system, through specialization, has now put value on that. If only he would have known. Now, like I said, I looked at it originally like he was sort of subject to that world that he was born in. So you have to kind of think a little bit like he was born right when the Industrial Revolution was starting to happen. And so, as I said, technology changes the world. And so, it's understandable if you want to put your frame of, put your frame of mind in this, that at that time, right, the factories were just getting started. You had families that worked in the field, and probably the family that worked in the field, maybe the family moved into the factories. I would imagine they were probably very unsafe at that time, right? There's probably a lot of things happening. And so that might have put some of that, sort of that lens that he viewed the world through. But ultimately, he was wrong. And ultimately, the other reason why he's wrong is that all of life is a struggle. But he put it into, like you said, this very static world that was really between, scarcity mindset and abundance mindset. And like I said, without being able to put value on human ingenuity and human ideas, he just really missed what was going on in the world.
You spend a little time talking about Marx's obsession with the centralization of production into ever fewer firms, and that industries would become more and more concentrated.
Right.
And there was an inevitability about this, and that the more concentrated they were, the more exploitation they would be able to carry out, and therefore the more wealth they could accumulate, and this would eventually explode into the revolution. But that, you give examples of why we shouldn't necessarily think that way, but also there are sometimes reasons that this, not always, but sometimes there are reasons for this concentration that are not entirely innocent. I mean, when we look at what happened during COVID, and certain gigantic businesses were allowed to function as before, but the mom and pop business had to shut down, obviously has had effects that will be felt for a very long time, and that were entirely in favor of already concentrated, of existing concentration, that is to say.
Yeah.
And that was not a function of the free market.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it was no function of the free market. A lot of people want to blame a lot of the ills in America on capitalism. But, Marx laid out 10 points of communism. And if you look at those 10 points that he laid out and you compare that checklist to the United States, you might say that we're about 70% communist. A lot of people don't understand that the central bank, all credit creation in the hands of the state is a communist idea. And so to your point, what happened during COVID and the centralization of the means of production is not a capitalist system. That was certainly a centrally planned. I mean, obviously it's pretty apparent, right? It was a centrally planned system that did that. I think one, as you mentioned, or you said Milton Friedman, I think, or did you say Rothbard? You said Milton Friedman. But as Rothbard points out in The Anatomy of the State, right, the goal of the state is to always grow, protect itself and to always grow. And so it's sort of a function of the way that this government continues to grow and continues to amass that power. But at the same time, one of the trends of Marxism, and you see it, Kamala talking about this today, is this equality, right, or equity as they want to call it. And really, unfortunately, it's not equality of a choice or not equality of an opportunity, but equality of an outcome. And when I think about like equality of an outcome, unfortunately, there really is no way to attain that, because you might even have a twins raised by the same family, the same parents, in the same neighborhood, the same economic status, the same school, same everything, but yet their lives end up in different places. Because when you look at it, it really comes down to the choices that we make. And so then you might have to ask yourself, well, then to end up in the same place, then we have to make the same choices. But how do you do that? Well, then you have to take away the choices, which then kind of going back to the example you gave during the pandemic. Well, if we don't give everybody all these choices of the different stores they want to shop in, or these different choices of these things that we want to do, and we centralize, now you have a couple big box stores and they all carry the same pre-approved products, then maybe we could get closer to making people make the same decisions, and maybe they end up in the same place. Maybe that's one of the traits of Marxism. There's so much more we could talk about here, but I want to respect your time and let you run along. So Go ahead and dig in, Tom. We got time.
Well, okay. Well, why the heck not? On this equality thing, I mean, I almost feel like in some ways, I feel like our conversation on equality in America and around the world has become more radical, maybe even than Marx imagined. In that, we have philosophers like John Rawls who argue, in effect, that all inequality has to justify itself in some way. That the presumption is equality. The moral presumption is equality. So if there's any inequality, it has to be able to justify itself in some way. So what he meant by that was the so-called difference principle. Let's say we have a society where doctors earn more than garbage men. Rawls would say that's okay because that inequality serves a purpose. If we said the garbage man and the doctor are going to earn the same, then we wouldn't have enough doctors, and then the poor would suffer. And so therefore it's okay for doctors to earn a little bit more. So okay, so in other words, every move from absolute equality has to justify itself in some way. But then if we follow the egalitarians all the way to the logical conclusion of what they're saying, if we really do believe that absolute equality is the ideal, then the question becomes, how can Americans justify their standard of living when we see around the world so much impoverishment? And, there are plenty of egalitarians in the faculty lounge who are willing to follow John Rawls to a certain degree, but they are not going to live like a tribesman halfway around the world. They're just not.
Yeah.
So what do you know? Rawls came up with a justification for why it's okay that we shouldn't have to worry about inequality between countries. We're talking about within a country. There we should try to see what we can do, but we don't have to do this between countries. But there's no moral reason that should be a difference, other than he knows he's not going to get the people in the faculty lounges to go along with that. So he just happens to have a convenient out in his system for this. But I guess my point is that even from the very beginning of his system, he would say that if there's inequality, we don't just simply say, well, that's just the natural outcome of human difference and the outcome of people's voluntary decisions. It all has to be scrutinized to see whether John Rawls will approve of it. It's just bizarre. And one more thing, there's an example in Anarchy, State, and Utopia by Robert Nozick of. Now, this will be before the time of some listeners, but most people will be familiar with Wilt Chamberlain, the basketball player. And he argued that Wilt Chamberlain, if we start at a level of absolute equality, Wilt Chamberlain will become a millionaire overnight the first time he plays basketball, because we will all pay to see Wilt Chamberlain play basketball, and then we all have a little less money, and he suddenly has a whole lot more. So what are we supposed to do now? Undo this? Like, are we supposed to unbasketball the last 2 hours and hand everybody their money back? But they don't want that. They want Wilt Chamberlain to have it. So as soon as you act, you disrupt the position of equality, which is why the state loves it, because you can never establish it. Even if you did, 5 seconds later, it's been upset, and then the state can come in and fix it. They love a problem that never goes away and that they can be spending all their time allegedly fixing. All right, that's enough of my rant. That was what I had on my mind.
I love it. And I think about where I mean, to the point that you're making, and I would also add on that it's not a good thing or a good goal. It's actually a bad thing in a sense where, I want Jeff Bezos' wealth. He needs to share some of that wealth with me. But I certainly don't want to work 80-hour weeks for 20 years like he did. I don't want that.
Yeah.
Like, I'm a surfer. I'm from Southern California. A lot of my friends I know have moved down to South America, and they live on a beach in a hammock and they surf and fish all day. Like, why can't they just go do that? They have to work as hard as Jeff Bezos, right? So it's like they don't want to go to school for 8 years and be a doctor. They just want to go on a hammock and surf and fish. And so it's back to the point that you made. They're voluntarily choosing to give the dollar to Wilt Chamberlain, or they're voluntarily choosing to go live on a beach and surf and fish all day. They don't need to have jets and mansions. They don't want that. And so it's like, why can't we just let people have what they want, choose what they want, instead of trying to force them into this equality bucket? Now, back to equality of an outcome or equality of a choice, or not outcome, but of a choice or a chance, there's some of that. And so I think, but again, if they want to choose to go live on a beach in Mexico, they should certainly do that. And I think, to your point about it being way worse than Marx had probably ever envisioned, I think that's sort of, one, the role of the state, and two, these virtuous people who can't do virtue in their own lives and just want to impose it on other people. And it's sort of back to just like an ever-growing state. It's sort of how this eventually morphs into, and they need to go save everybody. And some of that means they need to redistribute, I suppose, to save these people.
Mark, if people need more Mark Moss, where would you send them?
Yeah, easy to find. Just go to onemarkmoss.com. I have everything linked there. I make a couple of teaching videos per week, typically on macroeconomics and Bitcoin. So the Fed, inflation, macroeconomic policy, and Bitcoin. So if you like those topics, go check it out on YouTube. Just search Mark Moss on YouTube, and a little bit of freedom thrown in there.
Excellent. Mark Moss, thanks so much for your time. I appreciate you very much.
Thanks, Tom.
And ladies and gentlemen, don't forget my murder mystery dinner parties coming up in Charleston, South Carolina, Boston, New Orleans, and Dallas, Texas. If you live in one of those places or anywhere nearby and you're not coming to my murder mystery dinner party, how many podcasters are inviting you to one of those? I'm going to have to come after you. So check it all out at woodsmystery.com. We'll see you next time.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.